alaikum. Thank you so much for that incredibly heartfelt and incredibly generous introduction. It is such an honor, a deep, deep honor to be here speaking at this event to support 9 Muslim-led social service organizations. It's so interesting that this date, of course, was set many, many months ago, but it's a very interesting coincidence because you may have heard that Bernie Sanders was invited by Pope Francis to come to the Vatican to discuss the moral economy. And I was really struck by this because you have a pope that I personally admire and a politician that I think, I'm not endorsing anyone, but is probably the best option we have, talking about the moral economy, about helping the needy, about the fact that we shouldn't that worshiping money is a form of idolatry. And I thought, wow, all those ideas sound kind of familiar. Where have I heard this before? So we have a Catholic and a Jew discussing the moral economy, and no Muslim is represented in that meeting. And usually that's okay, right? This happens all the time, except in this one topic. Because we have more to say about the moral economy than any other faith. And this is not to boast. This is just a fact. It is a central concept in our faith. And not only a concept, it's not a theory. It's not something we pontificate about. It was an applied reality across centuries and continents. The moral economy. We call it Islamic economics. Some very rigorous analysis and experience with the application of these concepts of ethical economic practices. And yet we were not invited to that meeting. And what it made me think of is that had that meeting been about religious extremism, we would have been the first ones to get an invite. Because we're always at those meetings. As someone who works in Washington and at times is asked to engage on policy issues, that's the meeting I almost always get an invite to. Religious extremism. And what it really told me was this, that we still are constantly asked to tell the world who we are not. But very rarely are we invited to show the world who we are. And that's why I'm so honored to be here. Because this event is about showing the world who we are. This event is about the applicability, the execution, not just the talk, of this thing called the moral economy, of this idea of ethical economics in practice. And I am humbled to be a part of it. The thing about Islamophobia, the thing about bigotry and racism, is it keeps you on your back foot defending yourself. You spend almost all of your time justifying simply your right to exist, your equal humanity. Just defending and just explaining why you're not all the evil things you're being accused of. That you don't have the opportunity to give and contribute ideas and solutions to real problems because there's not enough airtime for it. And that's actually, I believe, the ultimate goal of Islamophobia. Put so much toxic rhetoric to surround this faith and this community that the beauty and the and the gem that is inside that will never be discovered. There's just too much to distract us. And yet, this event is about a group of people that is making sure that doesn't work. And that is amazing. So what I want to share with you today is why I believe that it is on us as Muslims to save our country from Islamophobia and racism. And I'm going to explain to you why I say that, why I say we need to save the country. Because I believe, and I will lay my case out for you, that this cancer hurts and threatens every single American. Not just the 1%, the 2%, the 3%, let's be really generous for a Muslim. No, the 100%. It threatens every American. But it's going to be on us as the moral inheritors of this faith to lead a movement, a moral revolution to save our country and our democracy from this cancer. So why is Islamophobia, why is it a threat to every single American? Is that really true? Is that an overstatement? Well, I'm going to make my case and you decide for yourself. The first thing is that Islamophobia opens the door to other kinds of racism. So there was an interesting study that the organization I work for, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, we came out with a study about a year ago called Manufacturing Bigotry. This study looked at anti-Sharia legislation, and it's a state-by-state law that gets proposed. Sometimes it passes, sometimes it doesn't. It's been proposed in almost every single state in America, and it's passed in about half a dozen states. What this law is, it's either anti-Sharia legislation or anti-foreign law legislation. What it does is it singles out Muslims to have their legal documents that are based on their faith principles to be rejected from American courts. So I used to think anti-Sharia legislation was kind of a joke or something, like passing laws against, Martian invasion. No one's trying to change the Constitution, right? But it's actually way worse than that. It's not just fear-mongering and has no impact. It has actually legal impact on real people's lives. I'm talking about wills that are written with the word Sharia or based on Sharia principles in places like Oklahoma are no longer admissible in court. Your divorce settlement based on the principles of Sharia no longer admissible. So it is clear singling out of Muslims for religious discrimination, and it's a violation of religious freedom for just Muslims. Now, I said this was a threat to every American, so how is that? Because the same lawmakers that are passing or proposing anti-Sharia legislation are also going after the rights of African Americans and Latinos generally, of labor movements, of women, of immigrants, and the list goes on. There's an 80% overlap between anti-Sharia legislation and these laws that curtail the rights of other historically marginalized people. So we are not one isolated group as Muslims. This is one symptom of a much wider disease. And it's a disease of fear. It's about people trying to marginalize a demographic that they feel threatened by. Whether that's people of color, immigrants, Muslims, or any of these other groups that I just mentioned. So Islamophobia makes it easier to go after people in other communities. The other thing about Islamophobia that's very interesting is that it's actually linked to anti-Semitism. And this is, again, based on a study where at Gallup we asked people, Americans, so a representative sample of the American public, about their views of Islam and Muslims. And we looked at all the different variables that linked with anti-Muslim prejudice. We looked at education, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. We looked at all kinds of variables. And we found that the strongest variable that predicted anti-Muslim prejudice was not low education, was not not having a Muslim friend, or any of these things that you would think. All these things were important, but they weren't the most important. The single most important variable to predict anti-Muslim prejudice was anti-Jewish prejudice. Anti-Semitism is the strongest predictor of Islamophobia. So yes, Islamophobia is a threat to many more people than just Muslims. Now let's say you're not a person of color, you're not a member of a marginalized community, and you're not Jewish. Does it impact you? Yes, it does. Because Islamophobia makes every single American less safe. It strengthens the terrorist narrative. Their narrative is one that divides human beings along faith lines, along cultural lines, and even more than that, it really just divides the world based on who's with them and then everyone else. Islamophobic rhetoric strengthens their narrative. They use Islamophobic rhetoric in their propaganda videos. It's that close of a link. So yes, Islamophobia makes us less safe. It opens the psychological space for alienated young people to hear that kind of rhetoric, and it might actually make sense to them. Because alienation is the single most important variable across extremist groups. And when I say extremist groups, I don't just mean Muslims, across the board. Any violent extremist groups, when you look at what they all have in common in terms of their recruits, it's alienation. It also distracts us. It makes us less safe because it distracts us. It distracts us from the real terrorist threat in America. And that real terrorist threat in America is white supremacy. I'm not saying that to just say it or because I'm against white supremacy. I'm saying it because that's the empirical fact. When you look at fatalities, American fatalities at the hands of domestic terrorists, the vast majority of people in America who die of terrorism, a terrorist attack, they die at the hands of white supremacists or anti-government separatist terrorists. So when we focus entirely on Muslims, we're being distracted from the real threat, or the threat, the majority threat, which is not Muslim terrorism. And then finally, Islamophobia makes us less safe because it radicalizes white supremacists and makes them violent, and gives them psychological permission to act out on that violence. And that's a threat to people of color, to Muslims overall, and to people who have the misfortune of being mistaken for being Muslim. So it's a threat to Americans because it radicalizes racists into violence. So that's how Islamophobia keeps us less safe, but it also makes us less free. You know, we hear a lot about the founding fathers from certain segments of our political elite, and they especially like Thomas Jefferson, one of their favorite founding fathers. And here's something Thomas Jefferson said. He famously said that the foundation of a democracy is a well-informed citizenry. He said, if you are not educated, if the population is not educated, rational, well-informed, then democracy doesn't work. Now, consider this. 80% of media about Islam and Muslims is negative. This is, again, a study looking at media content analysis. The protagonists that represent Muslims and Islam in the media are not religious leaders, they're not imams, they're not, scholars of Islam. They are armed militants. Contrast that with the Catholic faith or the Jewish faith, where religious leaders represent their faith in the media. This is, again, a study of content analysis of American news media by a group called Media Tenor. They're based in Germany and do this work for corporations and universities. Now, here's the thing about this 80%. Now, is that a high number or is that normal? People will always take that number and say, oh, well, the media is negative about everything and everyone. No, it's not. That's not true. When you actually compare media coverage of other religious faiths, Jewish and Christian faith, it's mostly neutral. It's not negative. It's mostly neutral. It's just about Islam, 80% negative. Just as a point of comparison, the percentage of negative coverage of North Korea, a designated terrorist state, is 72% negative. So you have a faith of 1.6 billion people more negatively portrayed than a designated terrorist state. That's the news on TV. Now what about newspapers that are supposed to be so much more objective? Well, one study found that the New York Times, the #1 paper in America, the liberal paper, right? This study found that the New York Times portrays Islam more negatively than cancer and cocaine. All right, so this is what people are consuming, even the elites, the educated, but just the general American. This is what people are consuming every single day. Toxic waste about Islam and Muslims. And what does it do? It creates fear, right? That's what it's obviously. Negative portrayals of a faith, that it's violent, that its people are violent, creates fear. People are afraid. They're consuming fear every single day. What does fear do? Well, here's 3 things fear does. And this is my argument why Islamophobia makes us less free, and it's a danger to every single American. Fear kills freedom. Here's how it kills freedom. According to neuroscience, now this is not psychology, this is actually your wiring, the wiring of your brain. It's a physical science. According to neuroscience, fear does 3 things to us. It makes us more accepting of authoritarianism, conformity, and prejudice. 3 things that erode the foundation of democracy, that kill our freedom, that make us submit our freedom, give it away in exchange for the promise of security. So fear kills freedom, and Islamophobia is all about feeding us fear. So yes, Islamophobia is a threat to every single American. And it's going to be on us to save America from itself, from this disease. So how do we do that? Well, I suggest 4 things. First, we have to recognize bigotry and call it out in media and in politics. The first step, the first action in this process of leading a moral revolution is at least raising our own awareness of this problem. And then calling it out, having that courage to stand up and say, no, what is happening is wrong. So how do we recognize this phenomenon? Well, it's in so many places. It's institutionalized racism on a law enforcement level. It's also rhetorical racism. I'm just going to start with the things that are more subtle, that aren't as easy to kind of pick out. Collective guilt, okay? Collective guilt is one symptom of this problem. It's demanding that Muslims be held responsible for the actions of members of their community who do something horrible. Because collective guilt is not applied equally. is it? When a member of the majority does something wrong, that person is an individual accountable just for themselves. But when a member of a minority group does something wrong, they are representing their entire community. And when that happens, we just have to call it out. As tiring as it is, as obvious as it seems, we have to keep calling out this assigning of collective guilt. And one way it's a sign that's a little more subtle is, of course, asking Muslims to apologize or answer for the actions of people they have nothing to do with, over and over and over. And we have to call that out and say, the fact that you need me to assure you that I don't condone the killing of innocent people simply because of my faith or the color of my skin means that you owe me an apology. Attributing evil acts to a person's faith or culture, rather than ever exploring external factors like, say, mental illness or a hard family life. It's actually it's a psychological error. It's called fundamental attribution error. And what it means is that when someone is in an out-group, when someone is not one of us, right? They're not one of us, then we see their evil acts as inherent to them. It's because of who they are that they did this bad thing. But when a member of our in-group, a member of someone who's like us, does something wrong, we want to find all kinds of excuses for them, right? Well, look at their family life. They have, even if they had absolutely, it's interesting, if you just look at what law enforcement will say in many cases, not always, when someone does something crazy, not crazy, but something criminal. You don't even have to you don't even have to know what the person, the criminal's name is, or what they look like. You will know the color of their skin just by how they're described. Because with no psychological, evaluation, with no looking at their history, they are already always mentally ill, right away. Because you need to find some excuse to explain why they're doing something horrible. If it's a Muslim, we never even check if they have a history of mental illness. I just heard about this horrific case. NYPD went after this Muslim man who had a very long history of mental illness. And basically what many believe was an entrapment case got him convicted of trying to do a terrorist act. He's now in prison and he just attempted suicide with a long history of mental illness. But this idea, a Muslim and mental illness somehow don't, it's not even a consideration. It's a very quick assumption that it's their faith that made them do it, not some external problem that they were suffering from. The other thing that's inconsistent is definitions of terrorism. I'm going to read you a real headline from a real newspaper. It's actually the Washington Times. It's sort of the conservative paper in Washington, D.C. Here's the headline. This was a story about the study that I mentioned that found that the majority of terrorist fatalities in America were at the hands of white supremacists. Here's the headline. Majority of fatal attacks on U.S. soil carried out by white supremacists, not terrorists. I didn't even make that up. Then there's also the inconsistent coverage of terrorism, which is something we have to call out. Anyone here, raise your hand, heard of Glendon Scott Crawford? Yeah, I didn't think so. No one's ever heard of him. I've asked a lot of different communities and audiences, and never does anyone know who he is. Well, here's who he is. And I'm quoting now. I'm reading a quote from a Reuters article. Here's what it says. Glendon Scott Crawford was a terrorist who attempted to acquire a weapon of mass destruction and to use it to kill innocent members of the Muslim community, said Richard Hartunian, United States Attorney for the Northern District of New York. He also was planning on killing the President of the United States. He received 99 years of prison time, and you've never heard of him. This happened, his conviction happened in August of 2015. Wasn't that long ago. 99 years in jail, a weapon of mass destruction, was trying to kill the president, and you've never heard of him. This is a real thing now. I'm not making any of this up. Imagine, just for a split second, if the identities of the would-have-been victims, Muslims, and the criminal were switched. Do you think you might have possibly, in passing, heard about this, maybe? So there's a real problem with not only the definition of terrorism, but the coverage of terrorism in our media. And that's why it always shocks people, and I get a lot of hate mail when I say publicly the majority of terrorist attacks, the majority of terrorist fatalities are at the hands of white supremacists. It's actually a fact, and it's in the literature, it's even in FBI reports, but nobody knows about it. And they think, they're offended by the notion, the possibility, even the suggestion of such a thing. And it's because there is this incredible bias in the coverage. So we have to call it out, and that's the first step. The second thing is we need to build coalitions, brothers and sisters, because we're not in this alone. This is not something that just impacts Muslims or one community or one group. We have to reach and take the hands of so many other people, so many other communities that are reaching out to us. One of the many things that bigotry wants to do to its victim is to make them feel small, to make them feel isolated, and to make them feel that they are all alone. And we're not alone. And we shouldn't feel alone. We have to build meaningful coalitions to fight this collective ailment. Third, we have to gain inspiration from success stories. I actually collect success stories because they inspire me and they keep me going. In my mind, in my heart, I believe in the inherent goodness of human beings because I'm a Muslim. And that's what we're told in the Quran. In fact, one of the most interesting things about when you study prejudice, when you study bigotry, is that people who know nothing about Islam, don't know the name of the Prophet, don't know the name of our book, have never met a Muslim, have no idea at all about us, actually have no prejudice. And people who know a lot about Islam, this is a very tiny community, a very tiny group of people, probably all in universities, but people who say they know a lot about Islam and Muslims also have no prejudice. It's the people in the middle who know something or think they know something. That's where the greatest prejudice lies in America. People have to be taught to hate. Left alone, they actually don't hate. They have no prejudice. They are harboring prejudice. Well, Americans actually know nothing about Buddhism. They know less about Buddhism than they know about Islam. And yet they have no prejudice against Buddhists because they've never been taught to have hate. And when you look at the media, and I just explained 80% negative, it's hardly a surprise. So there is good news, and I think we need to be on the lookout for that, for those success stories and gain inspiration from them. I'm just going to share with you a few of them. They're very quick. One of them is Miss Puerto Rico. Did you guys hear about Miss Puerto Rico? You know that she was suspended? Okay, so Miss Puerto Rico, this is a beauty queen, and she was suspended because of an Islamophobic tweet that she posted. And I thought that was was interesting because I don't really see the sort of Miss America organization as being too worried about Islamophobic rhetoric, usually, and it's not their thing, they don't care. But here's, when you look at sort of, you read the story more carefully, here's how it happened. It was a Spanish language social media campaign in Puerto Rico by Puerto Ricans that said embarrassment, hashtag doesn't represent us. And it was so big, so widespread, that the organization, the Miss America organization, had to respond and had to suspend her because the people demanded it. These are ordinary Puerto Ricans, most of them don't know Muslims. And they did that because they knew what was right and what was wrong. And that's a success story we should gain inspiration from. You all may remember this whole crazy thing called the Coalition for Humanity. There was 20 planned protests across the country in front of mosques. I think it was supposed to happen here in Atlanta. People were encouraged in this Coalition for Humanity to basically, if they could, come armed. Well, what happened? The protests hardly happened, right? Most places it was canceled. The big one in DC never even occurred. But what did happen instead is in many places, hundreds and sometimes even thousands of interfaith supporters and neighbors came to protect the mosque and to show solidarity. So those are the people that showed up. And in the few times, in the few places that there were some of these other protesters that came, they were vastly outnumbered, and in many cases were invited into the mosque to get to know the community. That's something I gain inspiration from. Because those people didn't show up because there was such a strong and loud and unified voice against them. They were intimidating because they were outnumbered. And I gain inspiration from that. From the power of relationships. Does anyone here follow Humans of New York? I love that Facebook page. So Brandon Stanton is a very neutral guy, right? Apolitical. But he decided to write an open letter to Trump. He said it wasn't a political decision, it was a moral decision. And he called him out on his bigotry in this letter, in this post. Did you know that it is the most shared post in the history of Facebook? Not 1 million likes, 1 million shares. A post declaring what was right, what was wrong, calling out bigotry. And I gained inspiration from that story. And my own story, you heard a little bit about it. What happened to me after 9/11, now I had friends whose Islamic schools had to be evacuated that first week after 9/11 because of a bomb threat. There was some serious threats, and I'm not, denying that or pretending that these things don't exist. There were mosques that were set aflame. There were mosques that were vandalized. There were people attacked and killed that first week. This happened. So when organizations were saying, don't go to the mosque that first Friday, it was a real question. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know what we were going to find that first Friday after 9/11. It was a natural day, a natural target for people who wanted to take out their confusion and their anger on the community. So we had to decide if we were going to go to the mosque that day or not. And actually, we were explicitly told, I remember there were alerts, national organizations saying, don't go to the mosque that Friday. It's going to be a target. It's better to stay at home, stay safe. And we decided to go anyway. We decided to go because we weren't going to let terrorists or bigots control how we practiced our faith. So we went. We went to the mosque that Friday. It was my first time in that mosque because we had just moved to this new city. It was actually Pittsburgh. And I was nervous. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what I was going to find. And as you heard, I walked in and was holding my 1-year-old. And the whole musalla was full, completely full. which was surprising because I thought it was only going to be a few people since everyone was being told to stay home. And then the imam announced a thank you and a welcome, because half the congregation that first Friday after 9/11 were Christians, Jews, atheists, Buddhists, people of faith and no faith, who had come not to attack us, but to show us solidarity. Allahu Akbar. And fourth, I think the final thing we need to do to lead this moral revolution is we need to stop telling people who we are not. And we need to start and continue and build on the work of those people who are showing the world who we are. And that's everyone working in these organizations that we're supporting tonight. It's not my job to fundraise, but I am asking all of you and impressing upon you the importance of this moment in our history, in our country's history, in our community's history. This is the work we have to do. These organizations are doing the hard work of showing, not just telling. These people, these organizations, these institutions are building an infrastructure for what Islam must be in America. And I ask you to dig deep in your hearts and in your pockets to support this important work. Thank you.